As we said in our introduction, the first works we know of to include elements of the fantastic were myths, which have arisen all over the world, and these stories later provided the basis for spoken and then written compositions. From Japan, for example, we have the story of Princess Kaguya, who is born on the moon and returns there at the end of the story. And there are Indian epics like the Ramayana and the Mahabharata, which feature flying structures called vimanas, which is the term now used for airplanes in many South Asian languages. The first imaginative works we know of, which were produced in the Mediterranean world, and which describe places and times very different from the ones their authors knew, were composed in early Greece and in Mesopotamia. These works were based in turn on earlier myths, which were created, adapted, and passed on by word of mouth, long before the development of writing or literature. Given these roots, it isn't surprising that our earliest written stories took the form of poetry, which had the set rhythms and structures we associate with songs, and was meant to be recited out loud to a mostly illiterate audience. The bard who performed it could also accompany himself on a stringed instrument. The earliest Greek works we have, the poems of Hesiod and the Homeric epics called the Iliad and the Odyssey, which date to the 9th or 8th centuries BCE, were fictional works which were based largely on traditional myths, and they claimed to know about places and times beyond conventional human experience. In Hesiod's poem, The Works and Days, he offers life advice to the poor farmers of his time, which he compares to the first ages of humanity. These were, he believed, very different from the world he knew. He also thought that each new age was, with one exception, inferior to the one that preceded it, which is why he labels them according to metals from more to less precious. The earliest of these, the Golden Age, he describes as follows. Men lived like gods without sorrow of heart, remote and free from toil and grief. Miserable age rested not on them. When they died, it was as though they were overcome with sleep, and they had all good things, for the fruitful earth unforced bore them fruit abundantly and without stint. Hesiod's garden sounds more than a little like the Garden of Eden in the book of Genesis. Like Eden, it's a place where the rules of nature do not apply. Adam and Eve do not have to work to have food, and the place is so warm and comfortable that they have no need of clothes. They also interact directly with God, and although, like Hesiod's account, the Genesis story implies the first people were mortal, they continued to live for hundreds of years even after they were expelled from the garden. We also find the image of an ideal garden in the Mesopotamian epic of Gilgamesh, which goes back to at least the 3rd millennium BCE. During his journey to find the secret of immortality, Gilgamesh comes upon the garden of the gods. All around him stood bushes bearing gems. Seeing it, he went down at once, for there was fruit of carnelian with a vine hanging from it, beautiful to look at. Lapis lazuli leaves hung thick with fruit, sweet to see. For thorns and thistles there were hematite and rare stones, agate, and pearls from out of the sea. Given the influence of Mesopotamian literature on the development of the Hebrew Bible, we might imagine that this description of a special and hidden garden had some effect on the picture of Eden in the book of Genesis, though the fact that it was made of precious stones rather than vegetation might suggest that it was not intended for the benefit of human beings. It's also not surprising that this garden of the gods was hidden away, given that the story takes place in the real world where such locations are unknown to us. The same thing is true of Genesis, where we are told that the Garden of Eden continued to exist after Adam and Eve were expelled from it, but was guarded by an angel to keep people away. After Hesiod describes the inferior ages which came after the first Golden Age, he mentions an age of heroes, which was in some respects an improvement. But when earth had covered this generation also, Zeus the son of Cronos made yet another, the fourth, which was nobler and more righteous, a godlike race of hero men who are called demigods. Grim war and dread battle destroyed a part of them, when it had brought them in ships over the great sea gulf to Troy for rich-haired Helen's sake. But to the others, Father Zeus the son of Cronos gave a living and an abode apart from men, and made them dwell at the ends of the earth. and they live untouched by sorrow in the islands of the blessed, and Kronos rules over them, and these last equally have honor and glory. These heroes, then, were the warriors who fought in the Trojan War, the at least partly mythological event which is at the center of Homer's Iliad. By this stage of Hesiod's narrative, the world itself seems to have obeyed the same rules it did in his own time, though the people themselves, or at least some of them, were nobler and braver than the hardscrabble farmers whose life he describes in his poem. While Hesiod's poems are relatively short, the Iliad was a long epic which focused on a short stretch of time at the end of what was believed to have been a 10-year war between the Trojans and the Greek armies who came to take back Helen, the wife of the Greek king Menelaus. Given that the site of the actual city of Troy, or Ilium, which was discovered in the 19th century, does show some sign of battle, there is reason to think that Homer was writing about an actual event. But this would have occurred during the Late Bronze Age, hundreds of years before his time, and that era was distant and unfamiliar enough from the reality of Homer's world that he felt comfortable using it as the setting for his imagination. One of the story's most memorable features is, of course, the hollow wooden horse devised by Odysseus in order to allow the Greeks to get inside the walls of Troy. The idea that such a plan would have been conceived or put into practice tells us that Homer was not necessarily trying to describe a realistic series of events. But what really sets the Iliad apart as a work of the imagination is the way that the gods appear as fully fledged characters who take part in the action of the story, much as God does in the book of Genesis. In fact, the 4th century philosopher Plato disliked Homer's poems because he thought that a divine being should not be portrayed as a dramatic character with human wants and flaws. We might compare this epic with a much more recent one, The Paradise Lost of John Milton, in which God is far removed from the action and is of very little dramatic interest as compared with the much more compelling figure of Satan. At the same time, the gods in the Iliad tend to interact only with one another and generally hang about Olympus, while the human characters see them as distant and inscrutable. The other work attributed to Homer, the Odyssey, adds to the world of heroes the idea that there are unknown islands which are home to all sorts of unusual creatures. Odysseus and his men are blown off course while trying to get home from Troy, and the places where they land are inhabited by monsters like the Laestrygonians, who are giant cannibals, the Cyclops Polyphemus, and the witch Circe. And while at sea, they encounter the Sirens, who lure sailors to their deaths, and the monsters Scylla and Charybdis. The fact that all of these places were meant to lie somewhere within the Mediterranean Sea suggests that it was unfamiliar enough to the Greeks of Homer's time, or at least the ones who, like most people, never traveled too far from the place they were born, that the notion of such unfamiliar places would not strain the audience's suspension of disbelief. But by the time of the Roman Empire, nearly 1,000 years later, the geography of the region was much better known, and the scholars who studied Homer's works tried to identify the places he describes with actual locations, and without suggesting that they had any magical properties. The idea of a golden age of the distant past persisted into the Roman world. In the 1st century CE, the Latin poet Ovid described that age in one of his works, where he emphasized the primitive but enviably simple life that humanity had once enjoyed. This was the golden age that, without coercion, without laws, spontaneously nurtured the good and the true. There was no fear or punishment. There were no threatening words to be read fixed in bronze, no crowd of suppliants fearing the judge's face. They lived safely without protection. Without the use of armies, people passed their lives in gentle peace and security. The earth herself also freely, without the scars of plows, untouched by hoes, produced everything from herself. Spring was eternal, and gentle breezes caressed with warm air the flowers that grew without being seeded. Then the untilled earth gave of its produce. Sometimes rivers of milk flowed, sometimes streams of nectar. The creators of stories of the Golden Age, or an age of heroes, also tried to account for why the world they knew had ceased to be the way it once was. In the accounts of Ovid and other authors of the time, the heroic age was brought to an end by a flood sent by Zeus to destroy humankind for its wickedness. The only people to survive it were a couple, Deucalion and Pyrrha, who were told by his father Prometheus to build a chest in which to survive the disaster and to stock it with animals of every kind. Afterward, they used birds to determine when it was safe to emerge and threw rocks behind them, which then became people. Most of these details are also found in the account of Noah in Genesis and are part of the much older flood story included in the Epic of Gilgamesh. The book of Genesis also agrees with Greek myth about how the ideal past changed into the imperfect present, in the sense that even after the world of the Garden of Eden had come to an end, and people were forced to experience toil and pain, things were not entirely as they are now. Instead, Genesis describes a gradual process of naturalization. In the age that followed Eden, people continued to live for a very long time, and it was they who invented all of the institutions, arts, and techniques that were familiar to the writers of Genesis. There were also at this time people who were, like the heroes of the Iliad, greater than normal human beings. They are described in Genesis as follows. When people began to multiply on the face of the earth, and daughters were born to them, the sons of God saw that they were fair, and they took wives for themselves of all that they chose. Then the Lord said, My spirit shall not abide in mortals forever, for they are flesh. Their days shall be 120 years. The Nephilim were on the earth in those days, and also afterward, when the sons of God went into the daughters of humans, who bore children to them. These were the heroes that were of old, warriors of renown. So according to Genesis, it was only then that human lifespans were given a more naturalistic limit. It was also the age that was brought to an end by the flood. But even afterward, Noah's descendants, who are described as regular people, become the founders of all of the nations known to the Israelites. This keeps them within the world of myth, like the heroes of all foundation stories. Romulus, George Washington, Kim Il-sung, and so on. While the creators of these ancient stories expressed them in the form of poetry, some of the writers of classical Greece, the 5th and 4th centuries BCE, included fabulous events in what were meant to be straightforward prose accounts of the past and of foreign land. Herodotus, who is considered the father of history because he wrote the first long analytical work about a past event, included a number of these stories in his work, whose main subject is the wars between Greece and Persia in the early 5th century. He begins his book by explaining that this war was the consequence of a long series of mythical conflicts between various Greeks and barbarians, including famous characters like Io, Europa, and Medea. Herodotus also revisits the idea of exotic foreign lands. For example, in his description of Central Asia, he mentions the technique used by the locals to mine gold dust. There are found in this sandy desert ants not so big as dogs, but bigger than foxes. These ants make their dwellings underground, digging out the sand in the same manner as do the ants in Greece, to which they are very like in shape, and the sand which they carry forth from the holes is full of gold. Though this story might seem to paint Herodotus as gullible, in another part of his book he criticizes as ignorant a belief held by the Greek that when their hero Heracles went to Egypt, the locals tried to offer him up as a human sacrifice. This, Herodotus tells us, could not be true, because the Egyptians did not even sacrifice most of their animals, let alone human beings. In general, his attitude toward his sources suggests that he tried to be as accurate as possible. But even though he believed that the laws of nature were exactly the same wherever you went, he also assumed that unfamiliar places and the people who lived in them could be very different from what he knew at home. He makes this point with the story about how there were people in Persia who, far from cremating their dead, as the Greeks did, believed that eating them was the only proper way to pay their respects. Herodotus was writing history, but several centuries later, in the time of the Roman Empire, a number of works were produced which were intended as fiction and which resemble in style the modern novel. These proto-novels tended to focus on adventure and romance, and often took their protagonists to foreign lands, either real places like Ethiopia or more legendary ones like the far north island of Thule. In the first case, The heroine is an Ethiopian princess who was born white because her mother looked at a marble statue while she was pregnant with her, and she is given a magical ring which protects her from fire. In the second case, a group of travelers journey to the frozen north, to the gates of hell, and to cities where people are blind during the day but can see at night, and where the women go to war while the men stay at home. The villain of the story is an Egyptian magician who has cursed the parents of one of the travelers to an eternal sleep. The idea that real but distant lands were a fit setting for such tales foreshadows the way that Marco Polo, 1,000 years later, and travelers to the New World after that, would bring back imaginative stories about what they had seen. We also find adventure, magic, and sorcery in two of the most popular Latin novels of the period. One of these, known as the Metamorphoses, or the Golden Ass, was written by Apuleius in the 2nd century CE. The hero of the story is accidentally turned by a sorceress into a donkey, and then undergoes a series of adventures as he is taken along by robbers who are unaware that he is actually a human being. In the end, he's saved by the goddess Isis, who was a popular deity among Romans of the time. The other Latin novel is the Satyricon of Petronius, which is full of the strange and exciting adventures of the two main characters. But though they're often put in danger, they are far from heroic. And while the things that happen in the story are often ridiculous, they are conventional rather than magical. The only episodes that involve magic are stories told by people who may or may not be reliable narrators. In fact, the overall tone of the story is more sarcastic and cynical than romantic or starry-eyed. The fantastic aspects of these ancient proto-novels were lampooned by the satirist Lucian of Samosata, who wrote in the 2nd century CE a book called A True Story, in which nothing at all is true. It's sometimes considered the first known work of science fiction, because it contains a trip to the moon by means of a strong wind and a war between the aliens who rule the moon and those who rule the sun. It also includes fish people and an island made of cheese. Lucian wanted to make fun of authors who were too accepting of the stories told about distant lands, and he singles out Herodotus for including in his work the sort of accounts we described a moment ago. Lucian describes as follows a battle between the moon and the sun. The vulture horsemen were 80,000, and the riders upon cabbage fowl 20,000. Now, the cabbage fowl is a mighty great bird, with cabbages all over him for feathers, but the swifter have lettuce leaves. On these rode the millet seed shooters and the garlic fighters. We had also many allies from the Great Bear, i.e. the constellation Ursa Major, flea archers 30,000, and wind runners 50,000. Now the flea archers ride upon very great fleas, from which they also have their name, each flea being as big as 12 elephants. And the wind runners are foot soldiers, but fly in the air without wings. One of the most popular fantasies of the later Roman Empire, from around the 4th century CE and the Middle Ages, was what we might call an early historical novel. This was the so-called Alexander Romance, which was broadly based on the life of Alexander the Great, who was the subject of a number of ancient biographies. But it was full of stories in which he encounters sirens and centaurs, brings the Amazons into his empire, and travels to China. And instead of King Philip of Macedon, who was his actual father, here his father is again an Egyptian magician. Versions of this book were translated into many languages across Europe and Asia, and the story became an important part of the medieval cycle of heroic and romantic poetry called the Matter of Rome, which is one of the imaginative works we are going to look at in our next lecture. Please remember to like and subscribe.